Before I get started, I just want to call out and thank the concept team at 343 Industries for providing a bunch of amazing imagery that I've used throughout this presentation, and also the internet, because I have borrowed a lot of images through image search, and if you have rights to those images, thank you for letting me borrow them without me asking. So I've been making video games for about 18 years. These are some of the games that I've worked on over that time. And I joined 343 in 2009. And 343 Industries was founded with a singular mission in mind, and that was to be the caretakers of the Halo universe. So if you think about the challenge that we took on as a new studio, it's pretty amazing. I mean, we were basically being asked to build a brand new studio from scratch, take over one of the most beloved gaming IPs that's out there, take it over from one of the most celebrated developers in our industry in Bungie. And at the same time, we would have to then maintain the existing community, the existing games. And in addition to that, we'd be taking over not just the games themselves, but the entire franchise. Everything from merchandising to comics, novels, you name it, anything Halo, all under one umbrella at 343 Industries. And in addition to that, we'd be quietly building our next chapter in the Halo saga, Halo 4. So you know, when you kind of lay all of that out there, it sounds like a pretty crazy endeavor. But the character of our team is such that the people that were drawn to 343 were the sort that wanted to take on this seemingly impossible task. And so over the course of 3 years, we grew the studio from a small core group to a team that numbered over 300. And to just kind of put that in perspective, if you average out the growth over the course of Halo 4, I think we were adding like one person for every 4 working days. It was an incredible ramp to support, particularly at some of the steeper points within that ramp. But it wasn't enough to just hire people. We had to hire the right people. We needed people who had the right mix of skills and talent, but more importantly, the chemistry and collaborative spirit that would be necessary to create a highly functional team. So we pulled together developers from all across the industry, people who represented studios from all around the world, each of them with their own unique perspective, their own way of creating games. And as we would add each new member of our team, we were forced to adapt and evolve. We had to take their perspectives and their expectations about game creation and fold them into our own and adapt our processes. So pretty early on in the lifespan of 343, we asked ourselves a simple question, the question of why. Why are we building Halo? You know, why do we want to take on this universe? Why do we build this game? And that question led to us creating a framework that we call the Halo beliefs. And these are a set of beliefs that we hold true to this day. They're beliefs that influence everything that we do across the franchise, and they were one of the creative underpinnings of everything that we did with Halo 4. And so those beliefs are, first of all, the belief in the importance of heroes. The fact that each and every one of us as human beings has a hero inside of us just waiting for that moment to emerge, and that Halo provides us the opportunity to let people tap into that potential. The second is the belief in the promise of humanity, that we have the ability to rise above our petty conflicts and one day seize the mantle and become stewards of our galaxy, that humanity is something with a promise worth fighting for no matter what the odds. The third is a belief in the power of wonder and of mystery, that our galaxy contains millions of secrets just waiting to be discovered, and that sense of curiosity that all of us feels when we think about all of those possibilities is something that's powerful and tangible and that should influence everything that we make. And lastly, we believe in the magic of creativity. We believe in empowering users to tell stories and share experiences, but more than just that, we believe in the creativity that exists within our core gameplay. So as you're on the battlefield in Halo, we're giving you tools to express yourself and be creative within the core of our gameplay, and that's really important to what Halo is. So there is another belief that isn't formally codified within this framework, but it's something that we talk about every day at the studio. It's something that influences everything that we do, and that's the belief in the power of storytelling. And so I want to take just a moment to talk to you about what story means to me, and then I'll talk about why I think it's important and how we applied story to the creation of Halo 4. So for me, story is something that grabbed me at a very, very early age. I was obsessed with story as a kid. I used to watch stories, I would read stories, I would tell stories of my own, and I owe a lot of that to my father. This is my dad here, and my dad was an incredible storyteller. He would tell me a story every night before I go to bed, but what I really looked forward to were those nights when he would make me up a story from scratch. My dad introduced me to a world of imagination in books. He introduced me to some of the greatest stories ever told, stories like Lord of the Rings. My dad was the first person to introduce me to science fiction when he took me to see Star Wars in the theater. And I remember that moment when the lights went down in the theater and I was transported to that galaxy far, far away, and I saw that story unfold through Luke Skywalker's eyes, and what an impact that had on me that lasts with me to this day. Probably the most important introduction that my dad made to my life was the day that he brought home a mysterious box. And he placed the box on the table and he wouldn't tell us what was in it. And eventually he began to unpack the box, and inside was our family's first computer, the Commodore 64. And along with that computer was a small stack of games. And over the coming days, as I dug through that treasure trove of floppy disks, because it was floppy disks at that point, I discovered worlds and stories in which I played the starring role. And it was at that moment that I knew that I wanted to create games of my own and tell stories of my own. And so, with all of this obsession that I've had for my life, around story, I often find myself asking, is story important? And if so, why? And I'm going to tell you what I think about that. So, story is something that is innately human. The act of storytelling is something that we do instinctively, almost from birth. If you look at kids playing a game, the chances are they're building stories to explain the play that they're engaging in. Story at its most obvious is a form of escapism. It allows us to step outside our day-to-day lives. But more importantly than that, it's a learning tool. It's something that allows us to make sense of the world around us. We use stories to complete our mental model of the universe. We use stories to encode important information and realizations and pass them on from generation to generation. And story allows us to experience things that might be outside of our scope of day-to-day life and too dangerous for us to experience or too rare. So, who here's seen The Walking Dead? Pretty much everybody? All right. So, you can imagine if you've seen The Walking Dead or 28 Days Later, just how prepared we all are for the zombie apocalypse, right? We have a level of knowledge of how to deal with that situation. But as much as stories provide us with a functional model, what's maybe more important is the emotional model that they give us as well. Stories allow us to relate to human beings and see things through the eyes of other people, which builds that all-important empathy. And I think, this is probably one of the most important parts of storytelling. So stories can allow us to understand what it feels like to be diagnosed with cancer, or to experience the loss of a loved one and the rage that might ensue, or simply just to know what it's like to be a stranger in a strange land. So, stories in games are about a two-way communication. It's a communication between the player and the creator. The creator creates a framework for the story, a structure, but then the player has agency to act upon that. And together, they engage in this act of shared authorship. And it's here that I think story really has the most power within games, because it's that sense of ownership that players feel over the story that they are co-creating that allows story to have the most impact. And one of the big strengths of games is that you identify so closely with the character that you play. And in a first-person game, this is particularly the case, because you're literally looking through the eyes of the character, and as a result, there's the potential for you to empathize even more deeply with what that character is experiencing. So, now you understand what story means to me and the importance that I think that it can hold within gaming. When we started working on Halo 4, we knew that we wanted to tell a great story. And we knew that we wanted to use story as a way to bind together all of the experiences that we were creating and to really reinforce them and allow them to achieve maximum impact. And so our story with Halo 4 begins with the return of the Master Chief. And with his return, we introduce him to a new world to explore and a new threat to overcome. And while this story would be a militaristic story, something that's traditional of Halo, all of the action and adventure that you would expect from that type of a story, we also knew that we wanted this to be a much more personal tale. We wanted to examine the Chief on a fundamentally human level. We wanted to delve into some of the things that made him tick and force him, through circumstance, to change as a character. So this was something that was very controversial with the team when we were pursuing this, because historically, Chief has always been kind of a vessel that you pour yourself into as a character. He's been an empty shell that you inhabit. If I look back to a talk that Matthias Warch gave at GDC 2011, I believe, great talk called The Identity Bubble. He describes this spectrum between a puppet on one side and a vehicle on the other, a puppet being that empty shell and a vehicle being a more defined character with more of a sense of agency amongst himself. And on this, you can see that Matthias places Halo at the kind of outer reach of the puppet end of the spectrum. And historically, in Halo games, this has always been the case. But when we started working on Halo 4, we wanted to tap into the surrounding universe, a lot of the things that had been done to define Master Chief as a character outside of the games, and start to bring that depth into the Halo 4 story that we would tell. And I kind of described this to the team as a marriage between player and protagonist. It's a situation where you never want to defy the player's intent, and yet you want to provide a more defined character in Chief. In the past, Chief has never made a decision for himself, and in Halo 4, that would change. So part of the way that we decided to explore this was to really delve into the relationship between Chief and his closest friend and ally, his AI companion, Cortana. In our universe, smart AIs, which Cortana is a smart AI, they have 7 years of a lifespan, and then after that 7-year point, they start to deteriorate. They literally start to think themselves to death. And so they begin to lose their mind and go rampant, which is very similar to human dementia. And so at the beginning of our campaign in Halo 4, Cortana is 8 years old, and she's struggling to keep hold of her mental faculties. And the Chief is faced for the first time with an obstacle that he may not be able to overcome. Can he not just save the galaxy, but can he save his best friend as well? Telling this story in a game like Halo was incredibly challenging because it's a very action-oriented game. And when we started embarking down this path, there was a lot of skepticism from members of the team whether this is something we should even take on. I remember long talks with Chris Schlurf, who is the lead writer on Halo 4's campaign, did a fantastic job. But early on, Chris was having a crisis of confidence. He was literally tearing his hair out because, he didn't know how to tell this story. And there were times when, he came to me and he said, maybe we shouldn't do it. Maybe we should just focus on the A story and put this story aside because I don't see how we're going to be able to tell it. And for me, it was really important that we tell this story because this was the human heart of Halo 4's campaign. And on a personal note, at the beginning of Halo 4, my mother was diagnosed with dementia. And over the course of the production of the game, I watched her deteriorate as a human being and become someone that I couldn't even recognize. And that was really hard, but it was also an inspiration to me to want to tell Cortana's story. And in the end, I think that this ended up being one of the most successful and powerful parts of the campaign story for Halo 4. So I want to take a step back and just kind of look at the various ways that we tell story in Halo 4, all of the different components of our story that need to be connected together. So you can see here I've got these bubbles that represent kind of buckets of different story. And you've got the story of the past games and the novels that's already in motion. We have the story of Forward Unto Dawn, the digital web series that we launched before the game came out that introduced some of the characters from our campaign. We have the story of Halo 4's campaign. We also have Greg Bear's novels that take place 100,000 years ago and tell the deep fiction of the Forerunner civilization. We have Karen Travis's novels that take place in contemporary times and have characters and events that cross over. We have the story that takes place in Spartan Ops and the CG series for Infinity that we use to tell story beyond the campaign in Halo 4. And then we have the Halo 4 terminals that are motion comics that explore the relationship between the Didact and the Librarian and the Didact's conflict with ancient human civilization. And so as you kind of look at all of these different pieces, all of which are interconnected, it becomes really obvious quickly that this is a little bit complex. As I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, if I have a hard time keeping all of this in my head, how do we make sure that this doesn't overwhelm the audience? And so the answer for us is, we kind of think of our story as an onion. And the idea here is that players can go as deep into the onion and sort of peel back as many layers as they desire. And each one of those layers should be satisfying and self-contained and hopefully not stinky like an onion. But the other way that we think about this is a narrative pyramid that has different orders of priority to the information that we're conveying. And so in Halo 4, at the top level, you've got your mission objectives. Where do I go? Who do I shoot? How do I succeed? And that's something that every player needs to know. At the layer below that, we've got the primary storyline, which is Master Chief's conflict with the Didact and, saving the galaxy against the Didact Promethean threat. The layer below that is the secondary storyline, which is the human heart that I talk about, the relationship between Chief and Cortana and his quest to try to save his friend. Beneath that, we have supporting structures. These are things like narrative drops that we place within our levels, voice logs, dossiers, environmental storytelling, things for players who really care about narrative to go and find little nuggets that are hidden throughout the game that deepen the experience. And then at the deepest level, we have deep fiction that exists outside of the game. So things like the novels, the Forward Unto Dawn live-action series. These are things that enrich the story, but are disconnected from the game and are not necessary for you to consume. And so the theory is that all of these different layers are self-contained enough and satisfying enough that depending on the player type, you can go as deep as you want into the pyramid and have a satisfying story experience. I'm going to talk in a little bit about a couple of examples, one where I think we were really successful in this, and one where, I think we could have been more successful. Maybe we missed the mark a bit. But first I want to talk about setting the stage. So, in a first-person experience, everything takes place within the character's view, and the character is essentially a moving camera. And so much of what we're doing and how we're telling story needs to be about staging. It needs to be about how we're setting up each of these scenarios so that we can tell the story that we're trying to tell. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of staging where we ran into obstacles through the development of Halo 4 and how we addressed those different problems. So the first is in the very first mission in Halo 4. So in this mission, Chief is reawoken from cryosleep by Cortana, and the two of them set out to find out who has triggered the alarms on board their ship. As they make their way up to the observation deck higher in the ship, Chief activates the blast shields and essentially raises the curtains to see what's going on outside the ship. And so this observation deck was purposely built as a stage. We had, a big open viewport that allowed us to accommodate a number of different events that we wanted to stage in this location. And so early in development of the mission, we had a ton of stuff happening here. The first thing that we did was we established the Forerunner planet in nearby space. And then we set up a Covenant fleet that was in orbit around the planet and a potential threat to Chief. The planet then awoke, and it started to scan the Chief's ship. And when it was aware of the Chief, it opened up and started to pull the Covenant fleet inside, and Chief's ship as well. And this caused the fleet to then send Phantoms desperately away from their fleet as they were being pulled inside, and those Phantoms then boarded the Chief's ship, and that led to the first encounter with the Covenant. So when we started testing this, all of this stuff was happening very, very rapidly, very close to one another in this space. And the reaction from players was, it all just mushed together, and they didn't really understand what was going on. Because there were so many things happening in such rapid succession, there wasn't enough time for any one of these events to breathe and for players to really take them in. And so the solution for us was, we went through and we moved a bunch of these events in the mission. And that required rebuilding parts of the mission. It required rescripting things. It required new cinematics that didn't exist before. But what we did was we de-emphasized the Forerunner planet in this location. We moved the first encounter with an elite to earlier in the mission when you first emerged from climbing the elevator shaft. And that allowed us to number one, feature the elite in a really cinematic way, but also to give Chief and Cortana a moment to reflect on the fact that the Covenant were back. We moved out the scanning moment with the planet and the opening of the maw, and we put that on the outer decks where we could really pay it off. And what we focused on was really just introducing the Covenant fleet as a threat and then having the initial boarding of the ship with Phantoms. And that allowed us to really focus this area, and as a result, the user comprehension went up and the overall experience was much, much improved for the mission. So a second example of this is in the third mission of the game, which is a mission called Forerunner. And this is the first mission where Chief encounters the Didact and his Prometheans. And in this mission, Chief and Cortana enter into a portal that then takes them to the center of the planet. And they step out into this dome-like inverted world. And this was something that was inspired when the team went and saw Inception, and we said, wouldn't it be awesome to have an environment where the walls kind of wrapped around on themselves, and this would be an incredible location, let's build it. What we found when we placed the player on the surface of the dome-like inverted world was that we couldn't really read the curvature of the surface. And this was something that Wade Mulhern, who was the lead environment artist on this mission, and he's amazingly talented, and he worked tirelessly to try, through both skybox and vistas, really sell that sense of a curved world that we were going for. And try as he might, we never got the impact that we were looking for. And in addition to that, this was a mission where you're moving around to different locations on the outside of the dome, but you never had a sense of spatial awareness when you're down at the surface of the dome. And so it was really hard to tell where you were moving to, or when the state of the world changed, we weren't able to really communicate that to players. So the solution for us was to create a transit hub platform, which would be the entry point into the world. And this was a platform that was floating around the outer edge of the dome. And what this allowed us to do was to create an objective perspective when you first entered into the dome, and essentially create an establishing shot within the player's camera. And this allowed the player to get a better sense of their surroundings and be spatially aware of what was going on in the dome. And we ended up using this platform multiple times within the mission, where we would come back and we would use it as a storytelling mechanism to show the transformation of the world around the Chief. And as the state of the world changes, this was something that was reflected here. So the next thing I want to talk about is tying into deep fiction. Halo is a universe that is incredibly rich, and we spend a lot of time building that universe that surrounds the games. And we made a decision pretty early on that we wanted to connect everything together as best that we could, because that was really important to us. So I want to give a couple of examples of where I think we did a good job of this in one case in Halo 4, and one where I think we missed the mark a bit, and I'll explain why. So the first example is a character named Thomas Lasky. This is a character that's first introduced in Karen Travis's The Thursday War, but he's really examined within the live-action digital series Forward Unto Dawn. And this is a series that follows Lasky as a cadet when he's having kind of a crisis in terms of his belief in the UNSC and the war effort. And then he runs into the Master Chief, who kind of teaches him the nature of what it means to be a hero. And then later, Lasky is a major character in our campaign, and he goes on to become the commander of the Infinity in our multiplayer that takes place after the campaign story. So the reason why this was successful, I think, is because Lasky, each of the stories that we were telling here were self-contained. So you could go and you could watch Forward Unto Dawn, and you could be really satisfied and feel like you got a completed story. The same was true for our campaign, and the same was true for Spartan Ops. I think the other thing was that this was a character very likable in terms of the characterization, but also he had a very simple and powerful arc. You know, he went from this reluctant, disbelieving cadet to a rebellious officer that helps the Master Chief, and then rises to become the commander of the Infinity. So it was something that was really clear and understandable. And contrast that against the Didact. So the Didact was our main villain for Halo 4. We wanted to introduce an antagonist that was worthy of the Chief, someone that could really threaten the Master Chief for the very first time. When we knew that we wanted to use the Didact in this role, we put a bunch of effort into exploring his character in a series of books, the Forerunner trilogy by Greg Bear. And this is a character that also appeared previously to that in the terminals in Halo 3. So there was a lot of background and texture that was developed outside of the main game. In addition to that, in the game, he appears in our campaign story. He also appears in a series of motion comics that are unlocked through terminals that are populated throughout our campaign. I think, you know, this was a character that really resonated with players. They really enjoyed him as a villain, but there were players that felt like his motivations were not clear. And we were like surprised by this because we thought, okay, you know, his motivations in the game are pretty simple. He's a badass alien who you reawaken and he wants to obliterate humanity, and you know, it's pretty clear. It should read at a basic level. But what we allowed ourselves to do in telling the story was we brought a lot of those more subtle motivations that existed in the surrounding fiction and allowed those to bleed into the main story of Halo 4. And what that did was it created the impression with some players that they were missing the larger story if they didn't take part in the books or if they didn't watch the terminals. And in addition to this, something that kind of compounded this was the fact that, you know, we had to move the terminal videos, the motion comics, off of the disk for disk space reasons, and we placed those on waypoints so players could go and watch them online or through the Waypoint console client. The problem with this was that it was outside of the main game, and so it was a frustrating experience for some players because they had to go through an extra step to get that information. So the next thing I want to talk about is the introduction of the Prometheans. The Prometheans were, for us, the new enemy class that we added to Halo 4. They were essentially the minions of the Didact. And this was a big deal for us. This was a big bet, because this would be the first time that a new enemy class was added to Halo in over a decade. And we wanted these guys to be fun to fight, as compelling to fight as the Covenant, and yet very, very different in terms of their behaviors. We wanted them to feel unique. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail because Scott Warner gave a talk earlier this week about all of the details of developing this enemy class and some of the challenges that we went through mechanically. I do want to focus a bit on kind of the main character in this enemy class, which is the Knight, and some of the challenges that we went through in developing him. So there were a couple of sides to this. You know, one was on the mechanical side, and one was on the visual side. And I'm going to show you just a bunch of images from the visual development of the character. On the mechanical side, we set out with a number of goals that we wanted to achieve with the Knight. but we weren't really clear up front in expressing what those goals were. We were kind of vague. We said, oh, we want them to be fun, we want them to be dynamic, we want them to be collaborative. But early on, we weren't clear enough about what success meant for any of those adjectives. And it wasn't until we became really clear in defining what the success criteria was that we were able to see sustained momentum and improvement. On the visual side, you can see all of these different iterations that we went through with the Knight. We rebuilt this character at least 3 times from the ground up during the production of Halo 4 because we weren't happy with it, with various different versions of it. We explored more robotic looks, more organic looks. We had a version where there was an AI rider that was inside of it. I think one of the big challenges here for us was that we had a conflict between the narrative aspects of this character, the mechanical aspects of this character, and the visual aspects of this character. And early on, we weren't clear enough about what would lead. And each of these different aspects were being, at various times, developed almost in isolation of one another. And so what we found was, we would go down a path with mechanics and then discover, oh, well, now we've introduced a behavior that doesn't make sense with some of the established fiction. Or we would go down a path with visuals and we would say, oh, this is a cool looking character, but it doesn't support the gameplay needs that we have for this character mechanically. And so it wasn't until we became really clear about what the prioritization was of these different elements and who would lead that we were able to find success. In the end, we were really happy with the way that this character turned out, but honestly, it was so painful, and we could have done a much, much better job of getting to the end point and done that a lot more effectively and efficiently. Along with the Prometheans, we introduced a whole cast of new weapons with Forerunner weapons. And this was a really exciting thing for us because anytime you get the opportunity to add new toys to the weapons sandbox, that's awesome. And when we started out, I was really pushing the team to go in a very sci-fi direction. I wanted to embrace the sci-fi nature of the enemies and explore a lot of really kind of concepts that were outside the box for Halo, things that you'd never seen before in the Halo sandbox. We explored things like a stasis gun and a grapple harpoon, and we explored a lot of really abstract sci-fi shapes in the design of the weapons. And what we found as we were testing these weapons with players is that the really deep sci-fi approach when we were taking it was something that wasn't relatable, and as a result, they weren't really gravitating towards these weapons. They would just toss them aside and use the Covenant weapons or the Unsc weapons and just sort of forget about these new ones, which really sucks when you're making new weapons and nobody wants to use them. That's not really achieving your goal. So ultimately, we turned a corner with these when we found a unique visual signature for them where we would have the weapons form into place and kind of transform to suit their user. And we had the D-res effects that would happen when you would kill an enemy with some of these weapons. And then we chose to really turn these into counterparts of existing paradigms within the Halo weapons sandbox. And so you can see here, this example of the Scattershot, very clearly an advanced shotgun. You can bounce projectiles off of surfaces, you can de-res enemies, but at its core, this is a shotgun. And as soon as we went down that path, we saw players understanding how to use these weapons. They became much more popular, and mission accomplished with that. So another aspect of the game where we employed story was with Infinity multiplayer. This was another big change for Halo, because if you look at Halo games in the past, multiplayer has always been kind of off on the side. It's been disconnected from the fiction of the universe, and we wanted to change that with Halo 4. So we created this ship called the Unsc Infinity, and this we decided would be home to our entire multiplayer experience. It was a ship that was introduced in our campaign where the Chief and the Infinity cross paths and they help one another on their adventures. And then the Infinity goes on to become the star of Spartan Ops and the Infinity CG series and home to all of the multiplayer modes within Halo 4. So part of the reason why we wanted to employ story here was that historically we've had these two audiences in Halo, two audiences that have some crossover, but not as much as we would like. An audience that loves campaign and an audience that gravitates more towards multiplayer. And by binding the experiences together through story, we wanted to bring these two audiences closer together. We wanted to create an experience that would allow campaign players to engage online in Spartan Ops and learn some of the skills they would need to be successful in multiplayer, and also introduce multiplayer players to the story of our universe and hopefully entice them to come and play our campaign. There's another push that we had with Halo 4, which was to make Halo a more accessible multiplayer experience. Historically, Halo's been very hardcore, and it's had a very steep learning curve that has turned off a lot of players. So we wanted to help new players find success. We wanted to give them opportunities in modes like Infinity Slayer to earn power weapons that they might never have got a chance to use in multiplayer before. And we wanted to use story as a way of contextualizing our sci-fi universe. You know, one of the barriers to entry with an experience like Halo is the fact that it is sci-fi. And so if I show you, these two weapons, the weapon on the left is instantly something that you can understand. But if you've never played Halo before, the needler on the right may be completely opaque to you. And so story, by engaging people in an ongoing story and showing them some of these tools within that context, it allows us to teach players some of the rules of our universe and get them familiar with our world. One of the big pushes that we made with Halo 4 was to tell episodic story in Spartan Ops. We created a new mode where we would release a new episode of a CG series each week, along with 5 missions that went live and tied into that story. And over the course of a 10-week season, we would be providing 50 missions and over 30 minutes of CG storytelling. And so for us, this was an incredibly ambitious endeavor, particularly from a production standpoint, but also creatively, because we'd never told story in this way before in Halo. This was a mode that was designed primarily as a co-op experience. And one of the things that was surprising for us to learn as we went live was the number of players that played this solo. We didn't expect that. We optimized this to be played with 2 to 4 players, and we balanced the experience accordingly. And so in hindsight, when I look at the number of players who have chosen to play Spartan Ops as a single player mode, I think, if we could go back in time, we would probably balance things a little bit differently to accommodate that. So I don't have a ton of magical takeaways that are going to, help you conquer the universe in creating your own games, but I can tell you some of the things that we learned. Some of these may be obvious. Some of them are simply things that we allowed ourselves to stray from over the course of development, and that ended up biting us in the ass. So the first of those is making sure that narrative is self-contained. And I think when you have a universe that is as large and as rich as ours, and you're immersed in it every single day, it can be really easy to get kind of inside baseball in your understanding of all of those different narrative pieces. And it's really important for us to be diligent about looking at every story that we're creating and making sure that it can stand on its own feet and that it's self-contained and satisfying enough in and of itself. And so that's something we have to keep reminding ourselves of each and every day. The second, and this should be straightforward, but clearly it's something that we allowed ourselves to get away from, is setting really clear goals for prototype. One of the things that we embraced with Halo 4 in our pursuit of quality that really paid off was a very iterative approach to development. But when you're entering into an iteration loop, there are all these different stages that you have to make sure that you're respecting. And so I've kind of defined what I think those stages are. These are my words, but you start by envisioning the experience that you're trying to create, and then you need to communicate or assert what that experience is in a way that is clearly understandable. What are the goals? And then you need to test and verify against those goals, and then take the results of that test, reinterpret them, and use that to envision the next loop of iteration. And I think every time we allowed ourselves to skip over one or more of these steps and get away from these different components of the iteration loop, we found ourselves spinning our wheels and not making the progress that we would like. So early on in the creative process for Halo 4, we were assembling this team of super ninjas from around the industry, and I think there was a real reticence to put boundaries in place because we were like, we want to keep things as open as possible because the possibilities are endless. And what we really discovered is you need boundaries, you need constraints. Great creative comes from dealing and rubbing up against those constraints and understanding clearly what they are. And so it's really important to put those boundaries in place and make them as clear as possible, as early as possible, so that people can really dig in and do their best creative work. This is one that is really not applicable to many people outside of 343 and the situation that we had. But I guess if you're taking on an existing IP with a large player base and a lot of passion and support around the current game, this is something you're going to have to tread the same balance that we did. And this was trying to find that delicate balance between familiarity and reinvention, wanting to evolve and drive Halo forward into the future, but not make it so different that we weren't bringing along the existing passionate players that we had, bringing them along for the ride. And so this was a balance that we really struggled with and kind of honed in on over the course of building Halo 4. Our team feels really, really strongly about quality. We're very, very passionate about pursuing quality, pursuing perfection in everything that we do. And sometimes one of the things we allowed ourselves to do was really get minutely focused on an element of the game in isolation and try to perfect that without looking at it in context of the larger whole. And so we have to keep reminding ourselves to make incremental progress across everything that we're doing and make sure that when we are honing and refining things, it's always being done in context of that larger experience. An example of this was with the night, where we would go off and we would be really trying to hone the visual look of the night without bringing all of that into the gameplay or vice versa. And anytime we allowed ourselves to go away from seeing things in context of the larger experience, there was pain. And finally, this is going to come across as a little bit trite, but I'm going to put it out there because it was so important to us. We learned as a team the importance of believing in ourselves and believing in our vision for Halo. There were times on this project where it seemed like we had an insurmountable challenge. It seemed like everything was stacked against us and we didn't know how we were going to make it out. And the only thing that got us through in those moments was trusting in one another, believing in one another as a team, and making sure that we always had each other's backs. And that got us through some of the darkest times and ultimately led us to the success that we experienced with Halo 4. And so for us, that success was validated with the launch of Halo 4. The response that we've had from the fans has been amazing, incredible, and just really rewarding for the team that worked on the game. And while we look at what we accomplished and we're really proud of it, when we think about where we want to go as a studio and where we want to take Halo in the future, we recognize that this is just the first step on a long journey and that we have better and brighter days ahead, but a lot of work that we have yet to do. And so that's my talk. And I think we've got maybe 17 minutes left to take some questions. If people want to step up, we've got mics on each side of the aisle here, and I'm happy to take any questions that you guys might have.
Hi, could you possibly elaborate a little bit more on making a balance between making the multiplayer more accessible and also keeping the hardcore fans happy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really careful balance for us. And I think, our priority with Halo 4 was to try and make an accessible multiplayer experience, something that would be welcoming to new players. But we also wanted to make sure that we were supporting and servicing the core competitive fans that have been there for years with Halo. And we had modes that were more geared towards that competitive side, and post-release we've continued to support more of the competitive side than I guess what you might call the casual side of the multiplayer experience, and that's very intentional because that community is so hardcore and committed, and it's a community that we feel really strongly about.
All right, so as I've been reading through the Forerunner trilogy written by Greg Bear, one of the questions that's kind of come up in my mind is how much creative freedom was he given in that process? How much of the game design was kind of feeding his process, and how much of his process was feeding yours in turn?
Yeah, it was a really interesting process because anytime you bring an author like Greg Bear, who's as celebrated and accomplished, you want to give him a lot of leeway in exploring his craft. And so, we tried to set out kind of pillars for him, things that we knew that we wanted to include in the game, and sort of where we knew the arc of the universe was going. But we were also very open to bringing Greg's ideas in and incorporating them into our game design. So it was really a lot of back and forth. We would read early manuscripts from the books and get ideas from Greg, and then we would be feeding back, sending him, some of the narrative development that we were doing on the game, and sending him images from our concept work to show him how different elements of the game were working out. And so we really partnered closely together.
Hello, I just had a quick question here. First off, I want to say that you brought a whole lot of amazing new innovations to the Halo franchise, so things such as the multiplayer item drops, the Prometheans were a ton of fun to fight, and the Mantis is about the coolest thing ever. But one thing that I thought was a little bit eyebrow-raising was the addition of Quicktime Events to the main campaign, which came off as a little bit strange to me, since not only has the Halo franchise never had Quicktime Events before, but there's only 2 in the entire game. There's one right at the beginning and one right at the end. I'm just wondering what the decision was to add them, and going forward, do you think you'll put more of those in the campaign, or do you think that they'll be dropped altogether?
Yeah, so I mean, early on there was a lot of discussion around how do we get the player feeling more immersed in the experience of the Chief's story. And so while there are kind of 2 technical QuickTime events within the game, there are a number of moments that are kind of first-person vignettes or interactions with the world that are things that haven't existed in past Halo games. And that was really a reflection of that desire on our part to connect Chief with the world more so than he'd ever been before. Those 2 QuickTime events that you're talking about, the elevator climb and then the final showdown with the Didact, was really about wanting to sell a moment, an immersive moment within the game, but wanting to connect the player more directly with that moment than just a cinematic. And so trying to bring a little bit of interactivity into that. I understand it's a controversial thing. There are those who are vehement detractors of anything that sort of rushes up against the definition of QuickTime event, and that's partially a reason why we didn't, sprinkle them throughout the entire game.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So this kind of crosses between the previous talk about the characters and then your talk about the clear goals and prototyping.
Yeah.
He mentioned in the other talk about the chess relation to the characters, and that the knight was the knight, and that there was plans for the rook, queen, and king. I was just wondering, as a producer, how much work was actually done towards those other classes that had to be cut, compared to how much, at what level did you have to cut that scope?
So we actually cut the scope on the other characters really early, on a couple of levels. Like one, we just realized it was something that was outside the scope of what we could create in terms of the amount of time that would be required to build all of the behaviors, all of the animation sets that would be required to support it. So those were ideas that existed more on paper and not really so much in prototype form. There were a couple of really, really early rough prototypes that we did, but for the most part, they were cut at the paper level and not deep into production.
So it wasn't directly affected by how long and stuff the knight was taking itself?
No, but I mean, the night ended up being kind of a validation of the decision to cut those other things, because it took us so long to get the night to a place where we were happy with it, and to think of trying to do that with 3 other variants would have been very challenging.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. I think one of the most remarkable things about Halo 4 is that even though it's a game about shooting aliens, deep down it's really a love story. And you talked about it a little bit, but was that a tough sell? I mean, how did you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, there were times where members of the team were skeptical about some of those aspects of the story. Whether you define it as a story about love or about friendship, the bond between these characters. I mean, the majority of the time that you're playing Halo, you're staring down the barrel of a gun and you're shooting things dead. And so trying to provide the space and the tone to be able to make those moments breathe and be felt was challenging, and it was something that we really had to be committed to. But yeah, there was definitely some skepticism on the team at times around whether we should be doing that, and I was just very adamant about wanting to deliver on that aspect of the story.
She's still alive, right?
Thanks for your question.
With Spartan Ops, you really gave a story to the multiplayer character that everyone was inhabiting. Was that a deliberate design decision? And was there at any point given more detailed personalities for a Master Chief side story? I guess what I'm asking is, were there ever a strong character in that role as opposed to the open create a character type thing?
Yeah. I mean, we had a lot of discussions around this with Spartan Ops, and it was an interesting compromise because we had to use CG in order to get the story done in the time that we had, because all of our internal resources on the cinematic side were supporting the campaign cinematics. And so we partnered with Axis Animation, and they did an amazing job of creating that series. But knowing that we were going to go the CG route, and knowing that we wanted to support the player's created character, meant that we had to create this sort of second set of Spartans that became a cipher for you in your experience on Infinity. So you were never directly playing as one of those characters, but you were sort of like, okay, I'm on the same journey that they are. And that was the difference between Majestic and Crimson. But there were times when we talked about early on, maybe we should just go with a defined character in this experience. But ultimately, we wanted to give players the ability to go in, play as their character, upgrade that character, and then carry it over into war games and play in competitive multiplayer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for a very great presentation. And I have one question.
Sure.
Yes, I'm a Japanese, and it is very interesting, the Halo universe cross-media experience. The storytelling, narrative experience in cross-media strategy is very, very unique. But in Japan, it is very, very common. Yes, we can see many cross-media experience in manga or animation.
Yeah.
And in the, usually, there is a person who has a much power to control worldwide total universe.
Yep.
Yeah. Sometimes it is a manga author, and sometimes it is a producer. And so my question is, who is control the Halo universe?
Okay, so just to make sure that I got your question, you're talking about transmedia or cross-media storytelling and universe building, and usually there's someone who's a very strong point of focus that's leading that and defining what that is. So I think at 343, that's Frank O'Connor. He's really responsible on the franchise side of building the overarching universe and the stories that we tell across Halo. And Frank and I partner very closely on the game experience within that, but Frank is working with all of the authors, all of the the comic book authors and the authors of the novels, to make sure that all of those different stories that we're telling are all knitting together into a grand plan. And he has a team of talented people that work for him that manage a lot of those different efforts across the universe.
It is very interesting because I guess that it is a person in my publisher, because a publisher has control every strategy. But can I understand that this person is in developer side?
Yes, yeah. So I think one of the big differences with 343 relative to Bungie in the past with Halo is we control all of the franchise. We control everything from the novels and comics and merchandising to the games to the Forward Unto Dawn linear. Whatever it is that we're building within the universe is something that is controlled and directed through 343 Industries.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, so one of the things that you actually didn't touch upon in this presentation was the changing of the Forward Unto Dawn's geometry in terms of the ship. How much of a discussion was had internally beforehand over that decision to kind of change the appearance and layout of the ship?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that you're asking about the Forward Unto Dawn, but I know that this is a question that comes up from fans about a number of different changes that were made to elements of, be it character designs or weaponry or different things across the universe that have been established in past games. Ultimately, as a team, we knew we were bringing a new team into place. We had a team of talented artists that needed to be able to express themselves. And we had an experience that we wanted to create within the game that necessitated changes to some things like layout. And we were able and decided that it was something that we were willing to accommodate to allow the artists and designers to kind of mold an experience that they wanted to create in Halo 4. And so I know that that's controversial for some people who kind of look at some of the updated designs for Covenant, for example, and see some of the differences that have happened there. I think anytime you have a new creative team that takes over a franchise or a universe, you're going to see some of that reinterpretation.
Hi. As I understand it, one of the lines in the sand for Bungie is they never wanted to have a progression system in their multiplayer, like a perk system. How much pressure did you feel you were under, and how many arguments did you have around the office about the decision to maintain that position?
I think, we had a lot of discussion around where Halo has always historically been a very even playing field, no matter what mode you go into in multiplayer. There's never any gameplay impacting progression. And yet a lot of the feedback that we had from fans was around how that wasn't interesting to them as a progression system, that they were really looking for gameplay impacting progression. And so it was definitely a debate that we had early on in the project, but we knew that we wanted to create a progression system and a reward loop that had a lot of impact. And for us, that's what led to the development of the progression system that you see in Halo 4. What we tried to do to kind of respect the idea of balance was to make sure that we had defined classes of weapons. And so we were allowing players to choose weapons within a given class as a starting weapon, but all of those weapons were balanced against one another at a given engagement range. So, whether you're dealing with precision weapons or close combat weapons, we were balancing each of those weapon sets against one another. So yeah, it was a different approach from past Halo games, and definitely controversial as we were going through that process as a team.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? I think we've got probably a couple minutes.
Okay, well, this one will go really fast. Will you be able to release that slideshow online for fans and for developers as well?
Yeah, I think we are going to be posting the talk. I'm not 100% sure, but we'll probably be posting the talk on halowaypoint.com. So cool. Yeah, you should be able to get it.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Thanks, everybody.